Okay, it is Monday, October 27th, 2025, and we're doing Module 12, an introduction to cargo, and this is Section 1. And I'm going to begin with some basic conceptual framework here. There's two kinds of ways that goods can be carried in terms of the business and the contracts and the nature of the relationship between the parties. And these are broad categories. They subdivide into others, but private carriage versus common carriage. Private carriage is where you have two business entities, usually corporations, that agree that business entity A will carry goods for business entity B, and they do it on some kind of an arrangement. And sometimes it's not even they'll agree to carry goods. Sometimes there'll be a whole vessel that's chartered out. And this gives you an idea of where we're going. Private carriage, the biggest area of private carriage is charter parties, right? That's the standard contract that covers most incidents of private carriage of goods. Goods are carried by ocean. A vessel is chartered, could be a time charter, or it's chartered under a voyage charter and freight is paid. And we'll talk about those subdivisions later, but the bottom line is these are agreements between two usually fairly sophisticated business entities that want to move goods from point A to point B and are using ships or other vessels to do it. And it's just arm's length negotiation between parties. You know, it's not like somebody holding themselves out as whoever you are will carry your goods, we have a scheduled service, which would be that. But in private carriage, you know, there's some influence of the law, but largely it's whatever you agree is the way it's going to be done. You agree to the terms, and whatever two sophisticated parties agreeing at arm's length and negotiation agree to, as long as it's legal, they can pretty much do it. Now, broadly speaking, towage is a form of private carriage, right? I have a barge, and it's loaded with my cargo, and I want this tugboat to carry it, and we've already covered towage, and you see there that you know, the law does impose some duties on the tug and some duties on the tow. And broadly speaking, that's a form of private carriage too. So I don't want you to think private carriage is just charter parties. It really is any arrangement of carrying goods by water that is done in a way other than common carriage, in a way that involves just a couple of, you know, corporations or business entities or even maybe individual people sometimes, but they're doing it as a private transaction. And basically, for the most part, with some exceptions, whatever the parties agree to is the way it's going to shake out. There may be some legal interpretation of how to interpret contract terms. There may be some duties imposed by the law, which you see with towage. But for the most part, it's just a deal between two parties, and they make the deal they want, and they charter the vessel, or they pay freight to move cargo from point A to point B, or they pay a towing company to tow their barge loaded with cargo, whatever. And that's private carriage. So in contrast to private carriage, and this is what we're going to focus on today, common carriage. What's common carriage? Anybody got a thought?
Is that like shipping containers? With like a bill waiting on?
Containers is, yeah, you could move containers in a private carriage arrangement. I could have containers and I could charter a vessel to load container cargo on it. But it's much more common, pun there, much more common in common carriage. It wasn't always containers because containerization didn't even begin until the 1950s and, you know, caught on in the latter half of the 20th century. But common carriage has been around a lot longer, but then it was like, you know, carrying goods that were loaded, you know, by, you know, they're in a big box or on a pallet and, you know, they get lifted by a crane onto the ship, put into the hold, but it could still be common carriage. The key with common carriage is the carrier, the vessel interest, they hold themselves out to be available to everybody, and they carry goods that way. In modern times, containerization is pretty much the norm. You don't usually hold yourself out to be a common carrier, and you know, you might have carriage of automobiles by common carriage, but for the most part, it's containerization today. But the key here is that the common carrier actually holds himself out to carry anybody's goods, and they usually have a scheduled liner service. So you know, you don't make a special deal to carry your aluminum ore from South America to Amsterdam. You get your container coming in from Rotterdam on a scheduled liner service we pick it up every Friday, we're in New York every Tuesday, like that. You know, maybe that's a short timetable. But the bottom line is, it's usually a liner service. So common carriage is kind of associated with liner operations, meaning they have a bunch of big ships that work on a schedule, whereas private carriage is sometimes called tramp shipping, kind of a derogatory term, but it really just means that you do whatever the deal is that you need to do to move the goods. But the bottom line is that common carriage is subject to a great deal more law in terms of external law, in terms of law governing how the parties can do business, than would be the case with private carriage. Private carriage, for the most part, it's what you agree to is fine. Common carriage, there's a very limited range of how you can agree to things. There are guidelines on what you can do and what you can't do. And it's kind of worth going into the history of how that happened, because it explains why things are the way they are. Things are the way they are because they were some other way before, and that was a problem. And so then something had to step in and fix it, and the thing that stepped in to fix it was the law. So let's look at 200 years ago, 1825. I guess I'll set myself up in this hypothetical as Maloney just came from Ireland, and he has a family piano that he once brought over from Dublin. And he'll pay this common carrier freight to bring over the piano. And what do? They drop my piano. Well, how do I recover for that damage to the piano? Well, let's see, it's 1825. Guesstimate what the state of the law was then. Well, at some point in history, maybe before 1825, if you just look at the law was pretty simple. If you're the carrier of the goods, you're ensuring that you're going to get them to the place in one piece. It's called the law of bailment. And that's actually worth writing down, because that's how it began, with the law recognizing bailment. What does bailment mean? It means if I give you my goods, or give you custody of my goods, you're responsible for those goods until you give them back to me. And if that's the case with common carriage, that means the common carrier has to be like the insurer of the goods. So under the common law, in other words, before there was any legislation or without any contracts, if I were to ship that piano, and the only thing that's applying is the law, we don't have any contract that says, you know, the carrier's off the hook if they break my piano. Well then, if they break my piano, they owe me for the piano. So now imagine it's 1825, and that piano is a fantastic piece of equipment that's worth, you know, huge amounts of money, like maybe $500, which in 1825 would have been a huge amount of money. So my piano is worth $500, and maybe they charge me $2 in freight. $2 to bring it over from Europe. Okay? Or maybe you make it $5, you know, but that's a lot of money in 1825. If they had to be responsible for destroying my piano just to earn a lousy $2 or $5, it wouldn't work, right? You couldn't possibly do business that way, because transportation is fraught with dangers. Things get damaged and broken and lost all the time. So carriers, common carriers, could not live with this bailment problem, right? Bailment means if you give me the goods, I'm responsible for them until I give them back to you. And you know, if I'm shipping cargo with you, you take the cargo, then you have an obligation to return it to me in as good a condition as you got it. No excuses, or else you owe me for the damage. Well, that works if I'm like, you know, hiring you to safeguard my piano, but if I'm asking you to transport my piano across the Atlantic, and you have to lift it onto the ship, and the ship is out there in heavy weather, and then it has to be lifted off the ship, things can go wrong. And you're not going to be able to make ends meet by charging me $2 or $5 in freight if the piano's worth $500, right? The carriers could not possibly do that. So what do you think the carriers did? If that's the law, what do you think carriers did to fix the problem?
They made contracts that said they weren't responsible.
Bingo. I'll repeat that when I'm not eating on the camera. They made contracts. They said, we're not responsible if anything goes wrong. If you want to ship with us, you have to sign this thing that says, any damage to your cargo for whatever cause is not our fault. We take it, no guarantees. We'll try to get it over to the other side of the Atlantic for you. If we lose it, if we break it, not our fault. And of course, the way pendulums swing, carriers wanted to push the very extreme exculpatory position. Exculpatory meaning freeing themselves from blame. So the tendency was for common carriers to avoid the bailment problem simply by contracting their way out of it and saying that we're not responsible for anything. And if you couldn't ship with anybody else, that was the best you could get. So you could maybe buy insurance for it, but the carriers weren't going to be liable no matter what went wrong. But that wasn't very good either, was it? That's the pendulum swinging too far the other way. So the law of bailment is very harsh. Carriers are responsible for everything. The carriers who have the upper hand in this bargaining thing, if they all get together and say, we're all going to have clauses in our bills of lading and shipping contracts that say, ship with us at your own risk. If you don't like it, too bad. And so then that's not good either. So how do you strike a happy medium? How do you apportion who's going to be responsible for what under what circumstances? Do you have to negotiate separate contracts every time with all the terms? Well, if the force of the sea is greater than gale force 10, then you can claim damage due to that, and you're not responsible. You wouldn't be responsible for damage due to that because it was that condition. But if you damage the cargo because of a collision with a ship, then you're responsible for 40%. But if you damage it due to flooding, then you're responsible for 20%. You can work out all kinds of deals about responsibility. But it wouldn't be very efficient to have every single contract of carriage in a common carriage situation do that. Carriers don't want to negotiate all the terms and conditions. They want to load the cargo on board and collect freight. Right? They don't want to have negotiations that take days and back and forth just to move one piece of cargo, right? So you need some other force to come in and make a kind of general agreement that will apply across the board to all these common carriage situations. And what forces in nature, human nature particularly, have a tendency to be able to make these compromises that affect everyone? We call it a three-letter word beginning with L, the law, right? So if you enact legislation that says carrier will be responsible for the following types of damages: negligent care of the cargo and this and that, but they won't be responsible for errors in navigation or this or that, that would be a start. And of course, there's going to be a lot more details in the legislation, but certainly a government could come in and say, in the common carriage situation, a common carrier owes a duty to the public, and we enact the following. Under such and such a circumstance, the carrier will be liable for the damage. In other circumstances, the carrier will not be liable, and there's a limitation on how much the damage can be, and if you want to cover it higher, so the carrier is responsible for the whole thing, you can pay higher freight, and you have to report it within certain days if there's damage, and you have a year to sue. All those details can be laid out. And they were. And the first instance of that occurred in 1893 with Congress passing the Harder Act. Harder Act was domestic legislation that covered shipments of goods on vessels from the beginning of the shipment, not even when they first got on the ship, but from the beginning. So if it was a warehouse to the ship, that counted too. But the Harder Act covered these shipments when they were going from a U.S. port to a U.S. port, and it basically did that kind of thing. It allocated who's responsible for what type of loss. It set up statutes of limitations. It did everything that I was just describing. But it only applied to domestic shipments between two U.S. ports. Now, in the meantime, that's 1893. So I don't know what was going on with maybe individual European countries had something like the Harder Act. But we're covering this from a U.S. perspective, so the Harder Act is really the first place we start here. The Harder Act is still alive and well, but it doesn't have a whole lot of application. And that's because other regimes, other statutory systems came in that by and large subsumed the application of the Harder Act. So what's the next one that came in? A big one in Europe, primarily. I mean, really at that time, we're talking about the transition from the 1800s to 1900s. The entire commercial world with these business contracts consisted of Europe and the United States. You know what I mean? The New World. I mean, yeah, Mexico too, but Europe and North America, maybe a little South America, but it was mostly the Western world. You didn't have players in Asia or Africa participating in these kinds of legislation and stuff. Right? They were considered parts of the world that didn't play in the same playing field as where the commercial stuff evolved. Europe, and then the offshoot to Europe, which was the New World you know, mostly English, Spanish, and Portuguese colonies that became independent, you know, United States, Brazil, South America, Mexico. Anyway, what happened in Europe is in the 1930s, there was an international convention, and it was called the Hague Rules, H-A-G-U-E. Everybody know where the Hague is? Den Haag, H-A-A-G in Dutch. It's in the Netherlands. Major international law center. International Court of Justice is over there. Anyway, the the Hague Rules were along the same lines as what the Harder Act did, some differences, but they basically laid out a plan by which common carriers could have a contract, but only certain clauses would be valid, and that contract would allow them to be free from liability for things like, for example, peril of the seas. If the weather got really rough and the cargo was damaged, they'd be off the hook. Or errors in navigation, paradoxically, if the vessel runs aground or has a collision, under most of these cargo regimes, they're not liable, which doesn't seem to make sense at first, but then you got to realize they're doing their best not to have a collision. But if they do, they didn't do it with the express purpose of messing up your cargo, and that's one of the inherent risks you take when you ship goods by water, is that there might be an error in navigation. So, you know, that's actually an out for the carrier. And anyway, the Hague Rules came in the 1930s, early 1930s, and then by 1936, I believe it was, the US enacted COGSA, which is really the basic one that we're going to focus on more than any of the others. COGSA is C-O-G-S-A, Carriage of Goods by Sea Act. Carriage of Goods by Sea Act. And COGSA, by its own terms, applies to shipments of goods going from or between the United States and a foreign port. So Harder Act covered the domestic stuff, COGSA covered the stuff that was international involving US port. And all of these regimes, whether it's Harder Act, Hague Rules, or COGSA so far, they all do basically the same kind of thing. There might be differences in the details, but they all basically allocate responsibility for the shipment between the two parties. And they allow the contract to exist, but the contract can only be for what is allowed by law. So, for example, a common carrier could not say, you know, consistently with Harder Act or Hague Rules or COGSA, they could not say, whatever the cause of damage, we're not responsible, sign here. That would not be enforceable, because the law has come in and said, no, you can be responsible for certain, you have to be responsible for certain things, for other things you don't have to be responsible. So carriers are very careful to put in the things they're not responsible for in their bill of lading, and they're not held responsible for certain types of causes of cargo damage. There's also other requirements. There's a package limitation, there's a statute of limitations for time. So it's working out a deal between, you know, the two parties in any of these transactions that involves shipping of goods. So now, getting back to our History Channel, 1893 Harder Act, 1930s Hague Rules in Europe, 1936, I believe, is the year the COGSA was enacted domestically, very much based on the Hague Rules. And then after that, you had some subsequent amendments to the Hague Rules. They were called the Visby Amendments. So the current standard now for most of the rest of the world is the Hague Rules with the Visby Amendments, which differs slightly from COGSA in several respects. But they're all basically doing the same thing. Now there's a fifth one I mentioned just for the sake of completeness, but if this video is watched by aliens in 20,000 years, my guess is it still will not have been ratified by then, because it's going nowhere. It's called the Rotterdam Rules. It was a lot of time and money and effort was spent putting together a set of new rules for cargo carriage internationally called the Rotterdam Rules. And I think maybe at most 20 nations have ratified. I think it takes 60 to go into force, and it's been a long time since anybody has added their list to ratification. So I mentioned the Rotterdam Rules only for purposes of illustration that there could be a new one coming in, but don't hold your breath. So for the most part, what we're talking about here is COGSA. But when I talk about COGSA, I also mean, you know, it could be Hague-Visby in certain contexts. If you were doing exclusively shipments in Europe between, you know, Bremen and Rotterdam, like whatever, you know, or London, or, you know, any two European ports, I assume Hague-Visby would apply, and you would have a slightly different set of norms than it would be if it were COGSA. But they all kind of accomplish the same sort of thing. They all allocate responsibility between carrier and shipping interests. And you get similar results with most of them. There could be a difference. Now there is one thing. and this is a thought experiment, and I don't know if I'm going to show you the bill of lading, but you all have it. There's a bill of lading in there. It says Puerto Rico's standard terms and conditions on your Brightspace Module 12 materials. That is a set of bill of lading contract clauses for a shipment between the U.S. and Puerto Rico on Horizon lines. Going to give you a second to find it. Does everybody have access to that? Anybody not? Good. Okay. So you will see in there a clause, and it may even say clause paramount. Is there one that says clause paramount? I could boot up and look at it, but there's a clause in there that says COGSA shall apply to the shipment. Anybody see that? Are they numbered paragraphs? Horizon lines, list of bill of lading terms and conditions. It should be fairly near the top. Anybody find that? The terms of the carriage of goods by sea act shall apply to this shipment, or clause paramount, some language like that.
I see the clause paramount.
Okay, could you read that?
Yeah, this bill of lading shall have effect subject to all provisions of the Carriage of Goods at Sea Act of the United States of America approved April 16th, 1936, as if set forth herein shall apply to goods whether carried on or under deck to the carriage of goods at sea between U.S. ports.
Okay, that's good. I don't want to go on too long because you're not going to come in on the mic, but basically this clause paramount very specifically represents COGSA. It even tells you exactly when it was enacted, April 16th, 1936. So when I said I thought it was 1936, now I know the exact date. But the bottom line is this clause is meant to make COGSA applicable to the whole shipment. Now here's a thought for you. This is a shipment between U.S. and Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is considered a U.S. port. Just a little trivia point based on what we talked about before. Would COGSA apply by itself to this shipment if this clause were not in it? No, because COGSA applies by its own force only to shipments between a foreign port and a U.S. port. Which statute would apply to this one between two U.S. ports? Trivia question.
That's not Jones Act, is it?
No, we mentioned it. You're close. You're off by one letter. It doesn't begin with a J. It begins with an H. Two letters. H-I-J. H. Harder Act. Harder Act, 1893. Applies by its own terms. So the problem is that nobody wants to have to worry about all the nuances between the Harder Act and COGSA. So this operation, Horizon Lines, which does a lot of work with all kinds of vessels, or did, they're gone now, but they just wanted a nice clear application of COGSA to the whole thing. So they applied COGSA to this shipment by means of what is called a clause paramount. A clause paramount is just a clause in one of these contracts. Could be a bill of lading, could even be in a private charter party. But it incorporates the provisions of either COGSA or one of these other regimes like Hague-Visby into the contract. So all of the defenses and things that COGSA allows are applicable in this contract. So this clause paramount was done in a standard bill of lading for shipments to and from Puerto Rico because COGSA would not apply of its own terms, so they simply made COGSA applicable. Now there may be a little nuance. Conceivably, COGSA, which applies only tackle to tackle, meaning when it gets on the ship and gets off the ship, and Harder Act, since it applies to further parts of the shipment, there could be a period in the shipment where Harder Act applies and COGSA hasn't kicked in, or where COGSA has ended and the Harder Act hasn't ended. In other words, the parts where it's before it gets on the vessel and after it gets off, maybe Harder Act still applies. But for the most part, this clause paramount has made it pretty simple that COGSA is the governing body of law that that applies to all this thing. So what else does COGSA involve? Well, for one thing, and this is also a very important point for people in the business to remember, COGSA has a statute of limitations. I imagine Harder Act has a similar one. I don't know offhand. But COGSA statute of limitations is worth spending a couple of minutes talking about. First of all, how long is it? Remember we did salvage, and I mentioned salvage had a 2-year statute of limitations. And I mentioned that there's a general maritime statute of limitations that sometimes applies where it's 3 years. And I did mention, we're back on to talk about the peril of the seas defense, which is one of the COGSA exculpatory clauses. So basically what that is the idea that when you put goods on a ship, sometimes the ocean gets kind of rough. And sometimes the ocean gets so rough that no matter how well those goods are packed, there can be damage or loss of cargo. Containers can literally be washed over the side, even if they're securely placed on deck. Cargo within containers can be banged around so much that no matter how well you've packed it, there can be damage. Imagine electronic equipment. No matter how well you pack it, there could be, movement that is so extreme that it damages components. A sudden boom, sudden move, and various forces can actually damage circuit boards. The sudden bang, the sudden move. So peril of the seas defense is interesting because you'll find a footnote in one of the sections there. I don't remember the footnote number, but I used to like to use the movie Spinal Tap as an example of remembering the number. And then Spinal Tap was obsolete, so nobody knew Spinal Tap. But apparently now Spinal Tap is having a rebound. It's coming back. Spinal Tap is being remade. So I might even put that video clip back up on Brightspace for people to watch it. But it's interesting because the number is 11. Does anybody know why 11 is significant in Spinal Tap? Yes.
Is their M scope to 11?
That's right. That's right. You see, most apps, they only go up to 10. But you need that little bit more. You put it up to 11. And then Mike Reiner, the producer, says, but why not just make 10 louder and then you go to 10? The guy's kind of dumb, but ours go up to 11. But of course 11 is the same as 10. And the reason I mention that, there's a very interesting parallel here. First of all, the footnote points out that the peril of the seas defense is really up to a judge's discretion, whether or not to allow it or not, but obviously they have to have some rhyme or reason. So everybody know what the Beaufort scale is, or the Beaufort scale? Wind speeds going up to certain numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4 on. Well, the footnote in the text points out that almost uniformly, courts will allow the peril of the seas defense if it went up to 11. So if the logbook says force 11, and then later on there's some damage to some cargo, and somebody sues, the carrier is off the hook on the peril of the seas defense, because it went up to 11, right? Okay. And it also says in that footnote, rarely will they find peril of the seas defense to apply if it's 9 or below. So that basically tells you 9 or below, no peril of seas defense, carrier is going to be responsible if the cargo gets damaged. Force goes up to 10, maybe. Force goes up to 11, definitely. You're off the hook. Now imagine a scenario, and this actually happened to me. I'm out there on a ship, I'm a mate on watch, and it's heavy weather. And I look at the weather, and I look at the wind, and the foam crests, and all this stuff, and I look at my Beaufort scale thing, and I want to write down force 10 on the logbook. And the captain's over my shoulder and says, you know what, Jim? I think it's an 11. Okay, you say so. You've been out here longer than I am. I have. Sure, 11. Why not? What's the difference? Why would it matter? Why would the captain maybe rather see 11 in the logbook? Who does the captain work for?
Would he be on the hook for it?
He wouldn't personally be on the hook, but he's supposed to save the company money. So if you got to force 10, better to put 11 in the logbook, because guess what? If the thing ever is in litigation and those logbooks are part of the evidence, well, it said force 11. Who's going to contradict that? There was a buoy out there that was measuring that said it was only force 10. Somebody on another ship is going to come forward and say, I was in that same area that same day and I swear it was only a force 10. So it's very much like Spinal Tap. 10 becomes 11, right? But you make it go up to 11 because it works better. But I've actually had, I did, and of course statute of limitations is run, I'm sure the captain is long dead, but I did in fact have a captain tell me one time to write 11 rather than 10 in a logbook. And for many years I had no idea why he thought 11 was a better number than 10. I didn't think it was, 10 and 11 are close levels, but I think by that time he'd been around long enough to know that in the company's interest, if you got a 10, turn it into an 11. So I like to use Spinal Tap for that thing because it's the 10-11 business. But the peril of seas defense it makes sense, right? I mean, if you're shipping goods by sea, and the sea some days is very calm and nice, and other days is like capable of breaking ships in half, then maybe when it gets that bad, the carrier should have a defense, you know? And again, the magic number seems to be about 11. Courts will almost uniformly apply the defense when it's force 11 or more. At force 10, maybe sometimes, maybe no. And I think in that footnote it says at 9 or lower, rarely if ever will they grant parallel seas defense. So that's where the magic numbers are in parallel seas defense. Excuse me. There's a very important consideration that I try to bring out every year I do this because it's counterintuitive. And I really want people to appreciate this. One of the exculpatory clauses, one of the things that gets the carrier off the hook is error in navigation. Now most people will say, wait a minute, I'm paying money to have my goods transported by ship. You're telling me if the mate falls asleep and runs aground or hits another ship and the cargo is destroyed as a result, it's not the carrier's fault? Yes, that's exactly what we're saying. That's exactly right. But if you think about it, it's not so crazy. Because after all, you know, the ships have plenty of incentive to have their personnel be careful and not run aground or hit other ships, right? It's not good for anybody. So by having the carrier responsible, it's not going to change the behavior of the crew. It's not going to make anything any different. But it is also true that when you undertake to have goods transported by water, there's a certain risk that things can go wrong. Vessels run aground, vessels collide. It happens, despite people's best efforts, and sometimes people screw up, but the bottom line is it happens. So what does that mean? It means that if there's an error in navigation, which means, you know, something that results in a grounding or a collision, it's actually not carrier's fault for the damages. So now let's look at the case, the collision case, because there's an interesting bridge here between what we just covered in collision and what we are talking about now. In the collision case, we had 3 vessels, and Judge Baer found the Kariba 100% at fault. Everybody remember that? We did cover this. Okay. So the Kariba was originally found to be 100% at fault. Now, in that litigation, there were parties that involved that were basically the cargo interests on the Tricolor. Remember, the Tricolor is the vessel that was overtaking the Kariba, and the Kariba turned in fog and cut the Tricolor in half. And those cargo interests were huge. The Kariba hit this vessel and sank it. On this vessel were millions and millions of dollars worth of brand new, beautiful Mercedes and BMW cars, right out of the factory, mint condition, brand new, every one of them completely ruined when it was sunk in salt water. So cargo interest on the Tricolor, they wanted, let's assume COGS applies. Whatever fault Tricolor has in the collision, the cargo interest cannot recover from Tricolor. Understand? If Tricolor had been found 100% at fault in the collision, cargo interest could not sue Tricolor because that's an error in navigation that exempts them from liability. Whereas they can recover money from the other vessel. So cargo interest on the Tricolor wanted Kariba to be more at fault than anybody else, or maybe Clara, the other third vessel. But the bottom line is, as between Kariba and Tricolor, 2 vessels that actually collided, the cargo interest on the Tricolor wanted more fault on Kariba's side. If Kariba was 100% at fault, Kariba pays 100% of those damages. Otal Investments, the owner of Kariba, pays 100% of the damages to all those expensive cars, right? Because Kariba is 100% at fault. Now what happened on appeal? The Second Circuit said Tricolor was partially at fault. They didn't give an exact number. There was a range, and I forget how it all played out after it went back down. But the bottom line is, let's say Tricolor ends up 20% at fault after it all shakes out. And the case goes up to the Second Circuit. Second Circuit reapportions Judge Baer's finding of 100%, and it goes back down, and maybe on remand, meaning when the court reviews it again down below, they come up with 80% Kariba, 20% Tricolor. We'll leave the Clary out of the picture just to keep it simple. So at that point, how much percentage of the damage can cargo interests for the Tricolor recover against Kariba? I just gave you the numbers. If Kariba is 80% at fault and Tricolor is 20% at fault, how much can the cargo interest on Tricolor recover from Kariba?
80%?
80% of the damages. How much can they recover from Tricolor?
0.
0. Thank you. Not 20%, because that's an exculpatory situation. They're off the hook for their share of damage due to navigational error. So it's an interesting dynamic because you don't want to shift the blame to the other vessel. I mean, that's not it's not weird. Everybody always wants to blame somebody else for something.